Welcome back to the Movement Professional Podcast. So this week I'm riding solo to conclude our discussion on different modes of training. Today we're going to discuss endurance training. So what is endurance? Endurance is basically doing any activity for progressively greater time. And it's important to kind of distinguish the intention of endurance. It's not necessarily to work harder, but it's kind of the opposite. You want to actually conserve or limit wasted energy by moving more efficiently so you can do things longer. So basically you want to utilize less effort so a movement endeavor can be sustained for a longer period. Within the movement continuum, which we've talked about for several podcasts, we could basically think about endurance type transitions as flow-based transitions. All right, so we're not trying to move typically too slow like we might with strength-based exercise. We're not trying to be too powerful like we would if we're trying to work for speed or for power, but we're trying to play somewhere in the middle. And the goal here is to utilize different elements such as tissue elasticity, reciprocal motion, and momentum to allow the body to find a path of least resistance when transitioning from one position to another. All right, so you can think of something like a body weight squat, or like squat's always a good example of how we can think about all these different modes of training and different ways to move. So if we think about a back squat, which is a very typical type of strength-based squat, the heavier the weight gets, we're going to have to try to move with a lot of tension in our bodies. We're going to have to move slowly just to make sure that the weight doesn't knock us over. But when we're thinking about endurance, we're not trying to make it too hard. We're just trying to do it longer. So if we just did a flow of body weight squats, we may use our arms that reach them forward and drop them down. We may, utilize our arms in different ways. We can also even find some of the stretch shortening cycle if we can kind of bounce at the bottom to stand up. And the idea here is that this is safe because the intensity of the activity is so low that we can actually kind of find momentum, go with momentum, go a little bit faster, but not fast to the point where we're not going to be able to do it very long. So we want the energy to be conserved, and that's the main focus here when we're talking about endurance, at least from my perspective here. So examples, that of things we do all the time where we're using these flow-based transitions to conserve energy would be optimizing reciprocal arm swing, trunk, and hip rotation when we're walking. So, there's a reason that we walk with opposite arm and leg swing, and we don't walk like we're carrying two buckets. It's just, if you've ever carried two heavy things at your side, it's not even the weight of the objects. A lot of times it's just the lack of ability to swing the arms and swing the legs that make you tired quicker. All right. So the way that we walk, or if we optimize walking, a lot of times it's such a beautiful movement for allowing us to have more endurance. And it's unique to, other forms of walking in the animal kingdom where, there's it's more quadrupedal, where there's two hands and two legs on the ground, where we have two legs on the ground, but we're able to use our upper body and our trunk and our hips in a very reciprocal manner. It allows us to go longer, but conserve energy as long as we're being efficient with that. Another example would be going with the momentum of a kettlebell swing. So if you've ever seen someone do a kettlebell swing well, one of the nice things about a swing is that you can actually go pretty heavy with it, but you can do a lot of reps. But you can only really get that endurance component is if you are really efficient with going with the bell, right? If you try to slow the bell down as it's going through your legs, it's going to get hard really quick, and it's not going to give you this combination of maybe strength and endurance. So depending on what you're trying to do with the kettlebell swing, the intention is often to go with the momentum of the bell, and then you can add progressively more resistance, but you still want to go with that heavier resistance, and then it gets harder to pop your hips and explode to bring the bell up. But the idea is you never want to stop the movement of the bell. You don't want to try to resist that. You want to go with it. And as you do that, you're able to do more reps than you otherwise would. So therefore, you'd be building your endurance with at least that movement. And then, the last one you could think of is if you're at the bottom of a squat, you oftentimes will see this in CrossFit endeavors. And you could see this for sometimes one rep in Olympic lifting, is where someone's able to get to the bottom of the squat, kind of ass to grass style, and they're able to bounce themselves back up. If you do that over and over again, you're actually conserving energy because you're using momentum and you're using the stress shortening cycle of your body to move you through some of the hardest parts of the squat. And so there's, depending on what the task is, there's value to that, to finding what you feel you're ready for, but also how you can use your body in a way that makes things easier for you. And I think that's an important conversation to have, because oftentimes we get into this mode where the way that we're trying to move or the way that we're trying to teach people to move is not consistent with the intention of the exercise routine. You see this a lot in group fitness style classes where the coaches are teaching this ideal form, but the ideal form might be for strength training or it might be for power training, but they're asking them to do 20, 30 reps. Well, you actually have to teach, or your body will have to find a different way to do that many reps. It can't be the same way that you're doing it if you were trying to do like optimal strength training. So I think it's important to understand that. An example in my history was when I first learned how to do a burpee in CrossFit, and I was coming from a mentality of everything should be tight, should be the reverse of a push-up. And then I'm going to jump through and I'm going to keep my body lines perfectly still. Well, I mean, I could teach it that way, but I'm not going to be able to do too many. And what I'm finding now is if my intention is to do more burpees or just to be more efficient and just popping up and down off the ground. So I'm noticing that I can't be so rigid. It's in things like jiu-jitsu where you have to sprawl. You don't want your body to be so rigid. You just want it to be flowy. You want it to go with the flow of the movement. And then be able to respond to someone else's movement. So there is value to kind of letting your body relax into positions, especially if you're going for longer periods. The key is that you want to have prepared your body to go for longer periods. And I think the other side of that discussion is sometimes, we're teaching these movements that are, to go real tight with the body position, often rigid. But then again, we're asking people to go for longer periods of time where there hasn't been enough time doing strength-based work. There hasn't been enough time doing power-based work where the repetitions or the durations are lower. And so we're kind of getting people confused because there's an entertainment value to, all right, do a lot of reps so you can get sweaty, so you can feel like it worked out. But I think endurance oftentimes comes later, although the goal is to actually conserve energy. That energy conservation typically comes with better body control. So doing things that are strength oriented first, where we're actually promoting a little bit more what would be thought of as good technique because we're moving slower, we're controlling our posture a little bit better. That can build the ability for us to say, okay, like I'm very strong with this movement. I can let myself go a little bit and I can flow so I can do more. And I think that's sort of where you can put endurance in this grand scheme of training. All right, so some of the benefits of endurance training, and depending on what we're looking at, so I'm giving an example of how you can extend out a movement in a gym and think of it as a strength movement and then progress it to an endurance movement depending on how we're flowing through the transitions. But we can also just think of daily activities of daily living or social endeavors. A lot of times those endeavors call for a lot of endurance, right? So if you're going on a vacation that calls for a lot of walking, you got to be able to do that and feel like you're not getting too beat up from doing that. So to me, that's one of the best values of endurance training, or at least valuing endurance, is that you're going to find you need it a lot. And especially as you get older, it's going to be the things that you want to do with others that you're going to want to feel like you have the endurance to keep doing that. So oftentimes the teaching is more about how to conserve energy and how to relax than it is about working harder. And that can be counterintuitive for some people. There's a promotion of energy conservation whenever we're talking about endurance a lot of times. And I think this can also tie into stress relief, mood enhancement. Endurance training, the ability to flow for longer, really tends to take a lot of the tension out of the body. And there's a process there that if you're able to do things longer, you're sort of teaching your body to let go naturally. And then there's just similar to what we talked about with cardiovascular exercise, higher rates of lower intensity aerobic activity is positively correlated with lower BMI, body mass index, and lower all-cause mortality. So it's a good thing to walk more. It's a good thing to get more steps in. How do we measure endurance? We can do it by distance traveled. You can do it by time moving or holding a position. We could also do it by repetitions to failure. And the distinction I'm making here is obviously there is endurance events, endurance sports, running marathons and things like that. But oftentimes the competition element of that, the people who win or are higher ranked in those endeavors, they're doing an endurance event, but their goal is speed. They're trying to do that distance quicker than somebody else. What I'm talking about here, at least for the time being, is endurance outside of the speed component. So when you're training endurance, the sole idea is to do something longer, right? So if it's distance traveled, it's basically how far can you walk at whatever pace works for you, but how far, like, what is your failure point of that? And sometimes that's hard to assess, right? Because we can walk very long, but then we have to have a conversation of saying, all right, like, how beat up did you feel from having to walk around Disney World for 5 hours, right? So you could do it, or when did you have to sit down? When did your back start talking to you? So, endurance oftentimes to me is more of a subjective type of assessment, because it does tie into daily life, I think, a little bit more than strength and power, at least from a training perspective. You could also look at it as time holding a position or moving in and out of a position, which is something that you can test in a gym a little bit easier. You can think about holding how long can you hold a plank, how long can you hold a wall squat, something like that. Something I've been doing a lot lately is just jujitsu drills where there's more of a flow element to it, hip escapes, shrimps, and just trying to do it for progressively longer periods of time, putting 2 minutes on the clock and just getting tired a little bit with that. But the goal is really to get my movement as efficient as I can so that I can do it longer without getting tired. And there's mobility that comes into play there. And then there's just actually an understanding of how to do the movement well that all ties into, finding improved endurance there. And that also can then, again, tie into repetitions to failure. So just as much as I can, put a time on the clock and just flow between positions and progressively increase that time, I could just test myself out as how many repetitions can I do before I tap out and say, like, I can't do this movement well. And oftentimes when you have a repetitions to failure type of assessment, you have to have some type of standard in your head for when do you tap out, because you can usually compensate in a way that can allow you to keep going, or you can work through some type of discomfort that you don't want to. But that brings us back to discussions we've had in the past about how do we look at understanding what we're ready for, where we want to look at making sure that we don't have pain. We want to make sure that we attain some type of postural control. And I think that the postural control piece is a standard you have to set for yourself. There isn't, every movement's going to have different postural standards that you set for yourself, but you just want to make sure that you make obvious standards to say, okay, I'm no longer hitting these standards. I'm going to stop there. How many repetitions did I get before I hit this wall? You can use breath control as another example. I'm going to talk more about how do you think about breath control with endurance. But if you have a goal for, all right, how many repetitions can I do before I have to start breathing out of my mouth instead of my nose? Well, that could be one way that you look at measuring endurance. All right, how much should I do? Again, I broke this up into 3 different parts. One, we can look at steps. Like, I actually think a lot of times people poo-poo steps, especially in the fitness community, quicker than they should. I think there's quite a value to measuring your steps, and it's not always for the same reasons that people tell you, but it's just, to me, a very easy way to gradually see how much you're doing throughout the course of the day and gradually see that improve, as opposed to making it specific to some type of exercise regimen where you have to go to the gym. It's very easy to get a step counter, to get a watch, and nowadays these step counters are also tied into many other functions when you have an Apple Watch or if you have a Fitbit. So it's a valuable thing to get a wearable that can monitor your steps. And to me, steps sort of differentiate the discussion of cardiovascular exercise. When you're looking at increasing your steps, typically it's outside of purposeful cardiovascular exercise where you're measuring your heart rate and trying to stay in a certain heart rate zone for a long period of time. Steps is just the movement that you're doing throughout the course of the day. And it can be purposeful exercise, but you almost don't want it to be. You almost want to separate out that category and say, how much am I just moving in my normal day? And can I add a little bit more to that? I find that to be a very safe way for people who are just getting into activity to increase activity. Instead of making it structured, just trying to get a baseline of what do you do on a regular basis without trying to change anything. Just look at the watch, monitor it for a week or two. And then if you're getting 5,000 steps a day, can you make it 6,000? Can you progressively make it 7? The American Diabetes Association recommends 10,000. To me, that's kind of an arbitrary number, but if you're below that, try to get to that. You could definitely do more. And it becomes more of a curiosity of where you are and what you can get to. One thing I've noticed is my day when I'm working with clients in person is very active. I have to move weights back and forth. I have to set up equipment for people, and I'm spotting people. So I'm constantly up and down in different positions. And if I have long days, I was getting 15,000 steps, really doing nothing but working. When COVID hit and I had to do most things on Zoom, it was hard for me to get 2,000 steps. So something like that was just, eye-opening to me. And I had to, understanding that I had to do quite a bit more in a structured manner because I wasn't getting very much in my day. But it just starts to make you think, okay, how can I get more movement? All right. And it doesn't have to be walking. It doesn't actually have to be your feet moving. There is value to standing up and doing arm swings while you're watching TV. Just moving the hands more, even when you're driving, doing some movements that would be reciprocal with the upper body. It's just to make you think about movement a little bit more and realize how often you might be still. I think that becomes quite valuable. So I'm a fan of steps, and from a standpoint of how much should I do, one, get your baseline and just do more than your baseline. Gradually build up more and more. Is there a limit? Yeah, I'm sure there is a limit, but that's usually not a conversation I have to have with people. The conversation I typically do have to have, don't shoot for some arbitrary number if you are far away from that number. So if you're getting 2,000 steps a day, don't shoot for 10,000 right away, but maybe gradually get up to that. Do a little bit more than what your baseline is and build that up over time. Outside of steps, the leisure discussion can be, make it a point, once a week, twice a week, to take a long walk, hike, cycle. And I think try to do it in nature as much as you can. If you're going to take a long walk on a treadmill, to me, make that cardio. Put a heart rate monitor on, see what your heart rate is. But for the discussion about endurance, what I would look to do is try to find some time where you can be out in nature. And if you can make it social, that would be great, where you can go with a walk with someone. And this isn't going to be something that's very structured in progression, but one of the ways you can look at it is that you're gradually increasing your distance as the situation allows. So the situation, how much time do you have available in your day? How much tolerance do your social partners have for what you're doing? Do they have more tolerance than you? Do they have less? If they have more, maybe try to get to the point where you can match what they're doing. Or, if you're limited by your partners, then that's fine. There's other ways you're going to get fitness in. To me, this is leisure, and this is, again, more about stress reduction, and just having this built into your day will be valuable over time. Things you can do if you find that you're with a social partner that you guys are mismatched is, if they have a little bit less endurance than you do, you can add a weight vest or a rucksack to sort of even out the playing field. So you're going, the same duration they're going, but you're trying to now conserve energy with some load on you. And you can, manipulate that load depending on, what the situation calls for. So I think there's a lot of ways to tie into nature, be social. These things are so valuable in the research for longevity and health. And this is where I think the endurance stuff comes in. Don't make it about trying to go fast. Be able to talk to the person you're with. If you're by yourself, focus on, relaxed breathing, nasal breathing, and just, take in the environment. And in this case, the endurance goes hand in hand with more time spent in a peaceful environment. So I think that could be useful, is where you almost have to save yourself from your own busy schedule. So if you break, half a time once a week, that this is either alone time or this is time with a family member, hold that sacred, and it becomes valuable, but it's also, keeping your endurance, at least, if not improving it. And then muscle endurance training, which to me is a different type of categorization, but it still fits into the idea where we're trying to conserve energy, but we're looking to do it, by gradually building up time in various positions or transitions. So I already alluded to that with some of these Brazilian jiu-jitsu drills that I've been doing, or it could be staying, low. If you are a tennis player, you're playing pickleball, which is very popular right now, is when you're shuffling side to side, can you stay low? Because if you can stay low, you tend to be able to get to your point quicker. You tend to be already ready to hit your shot. Same thing in basketball. I played basketball for years. If you're going to be good on defense, you have to be able to move well side to side, but stay low. You're better if you can stay low. So building endurance on staying low while maybe creating that side shuffling movement could be an example of muscle endurance training. And you can do it in various ways. You can focus more on just the static position of staying low, and then you can add slow movement, progressively faster movement, but the essence of it is to try to stay low, and that's going to make your muscles feel that, because there's a reason, as you're moving faster and you're getting tired in some type of sporting endeavor, that your body doesn't want to stay low. It wants to actually put you in the position that it doesn't have to work as hard, right? So in this case, we're actually trying to put you in a position that's a little bit more challenging, and then gradually build your endurance there. So there's still this idea of conserving energy. It's just that the starting point is already pretty hard, right? So we're now not going to be able to hold the position as long as we'd be able to take a walk, because we're putting ourselves in already a hard position that it might be challenging us with some functional or sport related endeavor. The other thing that I think works really well here for muscle endurance would be hanging positions, overhead hanging, could be, behind the body hanging, like if you think about gymnastic back levers and things like that, where you're getting a value of grip endurance, postural endurance, and it also tends to tie into shoulder mobility and things like that. So it's a big bang for your buck type of movement. And the longer you can spend in that position, it tends to demonstrate better health of your shoulders and your postural integrity. And then we talk about combining speed and endurance. This is something I alluded to when I was talking about the sports that are typically considered endurance sports, that you're going for long distances, but ultimately the goal of winning is to go faster for that long distance. So I'm not necessarily the person to talk to when it comes to how to win these events by any means. But just from a training perspective, if you're starting from scratch, and say you had a goal of running a 5K and you never ran one before, a 3-step process that I would look at to go through that, it would be, make sure that you start by learning to conserve energy for longer durations before you start trying to go as fast as possible. And I've made that mistake over the course of my fitness life. There's this, you have to sort of get yourself to have a bigger capacity to move for longer durations before the speed comes in. And then it makes the speed much easier. So if you're going to do a 5K, I recommend spending some time doing low intensity work up to maybe a 10K or somewhat more than a 5K. And then you have that capacity that you've built. Now what you can do is start to take shorter durations and work on speed in those shorter durations, because you have a big duration bucket that you've built. So if you've built a bucket of 10K as an endurance target that you can now do, well, now you can bump that down to a 5K and start to think about moving faster in a 5K. If you have no capacity for endurance and you just start trying to run fast for the exact goal of the race, oftentimes it's just going to feel awful all the time, and there's not going to be a lot of wiggle room for you to improve, right? So gradually build up the durations first, with the intention being energy conservation more than trying to go as fast as you can. Once you've done that, you take the distance down a bit, and now you start adding speed there. And then you gradually try to meet in the middle. You gradually try to increase the duration to whatever your goal duration would be, while you're attempting to maintain the speed you've been able to attain with the shorter durations. So hopefully that makes sense. And again, that's just, I wanted to throw this in here because a lot of times when people think of endurance, they think of endurance endeavors. So as you're training endurance, the value or the intention early on, again, should be not to work really hard, to conserve energy and just go longer. And that can be more enjoyable than people make it when they're trying to train for a race. You just often have to give yourself enough time to build those durations. And then once you have, then it's a lot easier to add speed to the shorter durations. So I think that can be a valuable 3-step process, especially for beginners that are like looking to try to improve endurance, but also maybe add a little speed to that endurance and have some type of recreational race goal. And finally, we're going to look at a breath control progression when we're thinking about endurance-based training. So typically, when we first get into the endeavor, we want to start with nasal breathing as much as possible. Just try to keep the breath through the nose. And that'll differ if we are socially active when we're doing our endurance work. So if we're with someone and we have to talk, we just want to keep the breath to a conversational breath where the inflection of our tone doesn't really change until it needs to. So when it's nasal breathing, you can think of it as we're trying to almost act like we're not exercising until we feel like we absolutely need to exercise. So if we're on an exercise bike, we don't want to breathe more than we need to until the endeavor calls for that. So if we start with nasal breathing, a relaxed face, the resting facial position that I like to go with is tongue behind the 2 front teeth, lips closed, teeth don't touch, just breathing through the nose. As the endeavor gets harder, we could progress to an oral type of breath, but the tongue will stay in contact with the palate, but the mouth can open slightly to start to let a little bit more air in. And then gradually, as the endeavor gets harder, we can increase the mouth opening as needed, but we want to still be prioritizing slow, long breaths. One of the ways to make this easier is that we can count the inhale, the exhale, and the retention after both the inhale and exhale, and try to keep those breaths as long as possible without forcing it. All right, so if you're trying to hold your breath too long, then that can backfire, and then you're going to feel like you have to gasp to gain that oxygen carbon dioxide balance again. But if we have a count in our head and we are seeing how long can we inhale for, how long can we exhale for, within reason, we'll be able to control the challenge a little bit more and control our breath a little bit longer. So the goal is to keep all counts as high as possible, again, within reason, for as long as we possibly can. And then we're going to gradually ramp down those counts without quickly reverting to a hyperventilatory state. So this is where, as we're holding our breath, or as our breath is extended out longer and longer, we just want to make sure we don't make that too hard of a challenge, so that we don't at any point revert right into a hyperventilatory state, because that's going to, basically, we're almost done with the endeavor at that point. If we get into hyperventilation, we're working too hard, we have to figure out a way to regain breath control. All right, so generally, we want to keep the breath low and slow. So low down in near the diaphragm. I'm going to think about lower rib cage, even abdomen, to minimize neck and facial tension, as well as grip tension. So wherever our feet are on the ground, or our hands, if they're in contact with something, we want to try to keep loose tension in the feet and hands as much as possible. That allows for more of a flow of our movements and less tension, therefore more endurance. That about wraps up the discussion with endurance. This would be the last of the podcast that we're going to do on different modes of training. Next week, I'm going to look to do an episode where we talk about different formats, incorporating all the different modes of training, and how we can think about simplifying all the possible movements that there are out there to do and categorizing them into things that would be a big bang for your buck, whether you're at home or if you have a gym. We'll talk about different equipment. Hopefully Corey will be back so we can have a back and forth there, because he's got a different training environment that he works in than I do. And, we have different experiences there. So that should be a very useful conversation, especially if you want to be very actionable with what we talked about. I felt it was important to go through the different modes of training so people understood, whoever's listening understands the intention of training really matters, right? We don't just want to work. We don't want to just get out there and, put time in without really matching our intention to the type of training that we're doing. And I feel like that's the biggest mistake I see in fitness is everything can be safe. Every movement out there, there's a use for it. There's a utility for it. But if that utility isn't matching the goal, then a lot of times people can get hurt, or they're not finding the results that they want. And I just feel like people work harder than they need to a lot of times, where fitness doesn't have to be as awful if we're well educated in matching the intent to the goal. So hopefully this series was useful, and you can go back at any time and look into this. But next week we'll kind of put it all together, and we'll try to put some protocol like workout formats together that I like to use, and I'll give some reasons why I think they're so valuable, and it'll tend to sum everything up and hopefully make it a lot easier to digest. See you next week.